George was a young actor just beginning to see the tiniest bit of success when the pinches started. Little pinches along his back, neck, and sometimes even his arms. They were always faint, but just strong enough to make him stop and remember it when they happened. The first time was when he met Paul. It was at George's first premiere. He had only played a small role in the film with no more than a few minutes of screen time, but at least it got him to the premiere. When it ended, Paul came right up to him and shook his hand for what felt like minutes. He introduced himself as some sort of executive this or that, but he barely spoke about himself at all. All he wanted to do was talk about George. He praised him up and down for a whole hour, pointing out the subtlety in his performance, how he could bring a tear out of one eye but not the other, and other things that George didn't even know he had done. When they finally parted ways for the night, George's ego was so inflated that all he could think about was how he was one of the most underrated actors in history, and his mind was so busy that he hardly even noticed that first small pinch. George and Paul stayed in touch after that night, and, as it turned out, Paul really was some sort of big shot executive. He even got George the lead role in an upcoming movie he was involved with. The strange thing was, though, George never saw Paul on set. In fact, they seemed to run into each other everywhere except on set. George really grew to like Paul, though. He was kind, listened well, and it didn't hurt that all he ever wanted to do was talk about George and the name he was making for himself. But as they got closer and closer, George started to notice those pinches more regularly around Paul. He would have said something, but he noticed them at times Paul was in the bathroom or 20 feet away. There was no way Paul could have been causing them. At least, not intentionally. George figured it must have just been some chemical in that awful cologne Paul used to wear, just tricking his brain into thinking it felt a pinch. But all that changed one night years later. The movie had been released, and sure enough, it was a hit. George became more famous than he had ever dreamed he could be, and the opportunities were only growing from there. George's bank account grew almost as fast as his ego, but no matter how much money he had, it was of no help to him one spring night. A rotting scent had been lingering in the air all day. It was so bad that, when George finally went to bed, it kept him awake. Eventually, he gave up trying to sleep and went to get some melatonin from the kitchen. But as he walked the dark halls of his house, a chill went down his spine. He lived alone, but that night in the darkness, he didn't feel alone. That's when he saw him. Paul, standing in the shadows. But he wasn't Paul. At least, not fully. George felt like he was looking into a strange carnival mirror that had somehow combined both of their faces into one. Paul? George asked, confused. But he didn't even have time to scream before Paul dove on top of him and pinned him to the ground with bizarre, almost inhuman strength. All he could do was watch as Paul pulled out the biggest fishhook he had ever seen and plunged it into the base of George's neck. George screamed and passed out from the pain. But when he woke up the next day, he didn't feel the pain or the fishhook at all. He ran his fingers over his neck 1,000 times, but there wasn't even a mark. George chalked the experience up to just being some weird nightmare, or the product of food poisoning or something. But when it happened a second time, then a third, a fourth, and a fifth, all in the span of a few months, George had no choice but to admit the horror that had become his reality. Each time it happened, Paul started to look more and more like George until it felt like he was looking into a clone, but a clone that had become more hideous and terrifying every time. By their latest visit, the creature, or Paul, or whatever it was, had grown over 8 feet tall, but it also looked more sickly despite its height and sinewy build. Its skin drooped all over its body, and it was covered in pus-filled sores. The same thing would happen each time. That awful stench would fill the air, and it would chase George around just to eventually pin him down and plunge another one of those fish hooks into his skin. But each day after, George always woke up without any pain and a feeling of euphoria and incredible pride. He felt as if everything in his world was better than it could be in anyone else's. Still, George thought of going to the police, but there was never any sign of break-in or even the slightest bit of evidence left behind when it happened. And despite these horrific incidents, his fame and success had only continued to grow. If a story like this got out, it could destroy him. Still, he wanted to know why this was happening. So one night, when the scent filled the air again, he didn't run, didn't try to escape. He just let the monster come to him and asked it that simple question: why? It gave an answer George hardly even understood, but when all was said and done that night, George let the monster bury another hook into his skin